You have spent years owing people an account of your time, and somewhere along the way, that accounting became confused with decency, as though disappearing without a full explanation made you careless or cold, when in fact Machiavelli identified the opposite as true. The prince who explains every absence, every withdrawal, every silence, has handed over something he can never fully take back, because once people expect the explanation, its absence becomes evidence of guilt rather than simply evidence of privacy. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why your silence does not require defense, what explaining it has been quietly costing you, and the specific shift that makes people stop expecting an account from you at all. Let's start with what the explanation is actually doing, because most people assume it is simply information when it is functioning as something closer to a tax. Every time you explain where you have been, why you went quiet, or what kept you from responding, you are not simply sharing facts. You are confirming again that your time and your attention are subject to review. This confirmation does not stay contained to a single conversation. It becomes a precedent, and precedents are remembered far longer than the specific explanation that created them. The person who has explained their silence 3 times has taught everyone watching that a 4th explanation is owed whenever the silence repeats, and the debt compounds, whether or not you intended to create it. And Machiavelli wrote that the prince who justifies his decisions to his court has already conceded that his court has standing to demand justification, and that concession, once made, is almost impossible to revoke. He was not describing rudeness. He was describing a structural shift in the relationship between a ruler and the people he answers to. And the same shift happens at a smaller scale every time you explain an absence that did not actually require defending. He says, "The explanation feels considerate in the moment. Its cumulative effect is a slow transfer of ownership over your own time, attention, and privacy to anyone willing to ask for an account of it." Here's what makes this difficult to see while you are inside it. Because the impulse to explain rarely feels like submission. It feels like warmth, like consideration, like the basic decency of not leaving someone wondering. This is precisely why the pattern is so durable and so rarely examined. Nobody sits down and decides to make their privacy negotiable. They simply explain once, out of genuine care for someone's feelings, and then explain again, because the precedent has already been set, and by the time the pattern is visible enough to question, it has become load-bearing in nearly every relationship they maintain. Machiavelli observed that the most successful rulers he studied were not cold or withholding by temperament. Many were genuinely warm, generous, attentive to the people around them. What distinguished them was a specific discipline around which warmth required disclosure and which did not. A discipline most people never develop because the two things feel identical from the inside. Warmth is choosing to show up for someone. Disclosure is justifying why you sometimes do not. Conflating the two means that every instance of warmth quietly obligates a future explanation, and every explanation quietly confirms that your presence was something owed rather than something given. The corrective here is not to become unreachable or to withdraw from the people who matter to you. It is to separate, deliberately, the difference between informing someone out of care and justifying yourself out of obligation. You can tell someone you went quiet because you needed rest, were overwhelmed, or simply wanted space, and offer that as information freely given rather than a defense extracted under the pressure of their disappointment. The distinction sounds subtle, but it is felt immediately by both parties. Information given freely closes the conversation. Justification given under pressure opens a negotiation about whether the reason was good enough, and that negotiation is the actual cost, not the science itself. Machiavelli's rule was never that a prince should withhold all explanation as a matter of policy. It was that explanation should be a choice he made from a position of security, not a toll he paid to maintain his position. The moment the explanation becomes mandatory in your own mind, the moment you feel you cannot let a silence stand without accounting for it, you have already lost the thing the explanation was supposed to protect. There is a Specific, practical test that tells you whether you are explaining from security or from obligation, and it has nothing to do with how the other person reacts. The test is simply this: if they pushed back on your explanation, said it was not good enough, demanded more detail or a different reason, would you feel compelled to keep providing it? If the answer is yes, the original explanation was never freely given. It was the opening offer in a negotiation you did not realize you had entered, and the other person's dissatisfaction with it will feel like evidence that you owe more, rather than evidence that the conversation should end. The person operating from security can offer a reason once, hold it as complete, and let any further pushback simply go unanswered, not from coldness, but from the settled understanding that the explanation was a gift and not a debt. This is harder to practice than it sounds, particularly with people whose good opinion matters to you. Because the instinct to keep explaining when someone seems unsatisfied is wired deeply into anyone who has spent years equating explanation with care. Unwiring it does not require confrontation. It simply requires noticing the moment you feel the pull to provide a second or third account of something you have already addressed once, and choosing, deliberately, to let a silence stand instead. 4 things sit underneath everything in this video. Explanation functions less like information and more like a tax that compounds every time it is paid, teaching everyone watching that your time is subject to review. The pattern is durable because it feels like warmth rather than submission, and the two are easy to conflate, even though they are structurally different acts. End of 12. The corrective is not withdrawal, but a clean separation between informing someone out of care and justifying yourself under pressure, with the second category retired entirely. And the test for which one you are doing is whether you would keep providing more detail if the original explanation was met with dissatisfaction, because the person operating from security does not. Machiavelli spent years in a position where every absence, every silence, every decision was scrutinized by people who had every incentive to find fault with it. And what he wrote afterward was not a defense of those years. It was a record of what he had learned about never needing to provide one. There is someone in your life right now who you have trained, without meaning to expect an account of your time whenever you go quiet. This was not a failure of character, it was care, offered consistently enough that it became confused with obligation, and the confusion is reversible the moment you notice it operating. You do not need to announce a change. This is a pitch, blush. You do not need to explain why you are no longer explaining. You simply need to let the next silence stand on its own, without the account that has always followed it before, and notice what happens to the relationship when it does. In most cases, nothing happens at all, because the explanation was never actually required. It was simply, for a long time, the thing you assumed you owed. One question before you go. Whose expectation of an explanation have you been quietly meeting for so long that it has started to feel like a requirement rather than a kindness you once chose to offer? Drop sobering in the comments if this gave you the language for something you have been carrying without quite being able to name it. I will be reading every one.